On the edge of the Kalahari Desert in South Africa exists one of the darkest places on Earth, Bushman's Hole. Deep within the dark, ominous waters are strange mysteries to be discovered and where rare creatures like the Bosmangat piranha and Bosmangat eels live. The hole is considered to be one of the deepest freshwater caves in the world, determined through sonar to be 885 feet deep and 748 feet wide. To enter the mouth of the cave, divers must climb down steep rocks to submerge themselves underneath the water's surface. Then, they must quickly swim through a narrow entrance wide enough for only one swimmer at a time. Once they pass through, the narrow passage opens into a vast main chamber stretching the hole's remaining depths 656 feet below. In the deepest parts of the cave, you can see nothing but darkness. You hear nothing but the shallow sounds of your own breathing. You feel nothing but the treading water around you. And there are only a few divers on the planet who have experienced these senses, visited Bushman's Hole, and dived as deep as 885 feet. Don Shirley is one of these divers. Don had been diving for years, interested in exploring the world underwater. In 2002, he met another diver who was as passionate as he was, Dave Shaw. They were instant friends, bonding over their love and curiosity about the world. They both dreamed of going on a dive together one day. A couple of years later, they made the dream a reality. Don took Dave to dive at Bushman's Hole. On dive day, both men were buzzing with the excitement that lay before them. They reached the puddle, geared up, and discussed the plan. Dave was going to dive in first. He submerged himself into the dark water, swimming towards the narrow passage leading to the open cave. Emerging from the path, he faced almost 1,000 feet of darkness. He glanced around the cave, with his high-intensity light spotlighting his surroundings, and he began the descent. 10 minutes of descent went by, and Dave was sure the bottom was near. The darkness of the cave and the emptiness were starting to close in around him. He shone his light downward to search for rocks, mud, or any sign that he was close to the end. Finally, he made contact with the foundation of the cave. His sole focus was reaching the bottom of the dark trench, and now that he had, Dave realized how foreign his surroundings felt to him. He couldn't clearly see the hundreds of feet of vast water that had enveloped him. He was more than 800 feet deep into the cavern, feeling the isolation and peace he had never been able to experience in his typical routines. But his day-to-day life never included the high stakes that his diving did, and he knew he only had limited time. With every minute he spent at those depths, he had an hour of decompression when he began the ascent. Feeling curiously relaxed, he looked around the cavernous depths around him and revealed that he was the first man in history to reach this depth. Or was he? Because 50 feet to his left, as though a spotlight was on it, Dave saw a body, arms reaching upwards, as if still trying to swim to the surface. On August 7th, 1974, Dion Dreyer was born in South Africa to his father Theo, a business owner, and his mother Marie. Dion was a daredevil at heart. He loved the feeling of adrenaline pumping through his body. He enjoyed hunting, racing, and motorcycling. But his passion was diving. He was invited to join an expedition to the bottom of Bushman's Hole. The team planned to descend 492 feet into the cave and asked Dion to support the divers. To prepare for the deep technical dive, Dion swam into Bushman's Hole with the team to test the conditions. As the team began the ascent to the surface, one of the divers looked around for Dion. It wasn't until they looked down and saw that Dion's light was fading. He was sinking down, deeper and deeper into the dark abyss. The team continued the ascent so they didn't meet the same fate as Dion, but they panicked as they closed in on the surface. They assumed that Dion's breathing was too quick, which let CO2 build up in his lungs. He blacked out and sank. Dave Shaw floated at the bottom of the trench, staring at the body before him. Dion's tanks and harness were snug around the wetsuit that clung to a decaying body. Dion's head and hands were skeletonized after long-term exposure to the water. Shaw attempted to pull Dion's body up, but he wouldn't budge. It was almost as if Dion's body was filled with rock. It was so heavy. But Shaw didn't want to give up, so he tied the cave reel to Dion's tanks to find the body again and began his ascent. When he reached 400 feet, Dave met with his friend Don Shirley. He quickly scribbled on an underwater slate, 270 meters found body. The men looked at one another, and Dave could see Shaw's mixed looks of surprise and fear. They collected themselves, and they met at the surface eventually. That's when Shaw shared with Shirley about the plaque he'd seen at the cave's entrance and that he thought the body belonged to the boy who had drowned years before. He felt a personal connection to Dion's story and the abandoned body since he was the one to find him, and he made it his personal mission to resurface the body for Dion's family. Shirley understood Shaw's connection and determination. So, the two divers scheduled a date in January to return. They called it the Big Dive and began preparing immediately. The men consulted with forensics experts who shared the opinion that Dion's body was mostly bone, influencing the team's decision to get the body into a drawstring body bag to prevent it from falling apart. They practiced getting a body underwater into the bag, with Shirley playing the role of Dion's corpse. At 66 feet, the process went smoothly in under a couple of minutes. But they couldn't take any chances. 66 feet was vastly different from 800. They brought 35 backup gas cylinders into the water, enough for Shaw and support divers to survive total rebreather failure. They also created a rope sling system so they could be hauled to a recompression chamber. And in a severe medical emergency, Shirley recruited a doctor who specialized in diving physiology. Everything was planned, with backup plans to backup plans. However, Shaw and Shirley still needed to discuss their personal protocol. Shirley asked his friend, "If you have problems, do you want me to come down?" Shaw responded, "Yes, but only come down if I signal." And the night before the deadly dive, the two men gathered their team and said, "If Dave doesn't make it, if I don't make it, we stay there. That's the end of the story. We don't want to be recovered." On January 8th, Shaw and Shirley woke at 4 a.m. to the surrounding Saturday morning darkness. Even with the extensive planning, they were anxious about the day ahead. They dressed lightly and meandered towards their car. Key to ignition, they started the vehicle, put it in drive, and began the 10-minute drive to the trench. They reached the water and put on their wetsuits and diving equipment. One leg in the suit, two legs, arms through, and zip. Every movement was meticulous and focused, with a nip in the air from the team's anxious energy. Everyone had their assignment, but it did not relieve the day's stress ahead of them. The teams were assembled in their designated spots. Theo and Marie Dreyer were invited to be present during the dive so they could witness the long-awaited rescue of their son and finally say a proper goodbye. At 6:13 a.m., Shaw and Shirley looked at one another with understanding eyes, shook each other's hands, and Shaw ducked beneath the water. He made his way through the dark, narrow passage and paused before beginning his 800-foot descent. Shaw reached the bottom in 11 minutes. His feet glided against the trench floor as he started his search for Dion's body. His light illuminated Dion's floating corpse quickly, and Shaw pulled out the body bag. He heavily knelt alongside the body and began guiding the body towards the bag, one step closer to being dug out of his watery grace. And that's when Dave began to feel something was wrong. Only a few minutes later, Shirley had swam to the rendezvous point to meet Shaw, and Shirley looked down to see Shaw's light. He felt comforted until he realized that, while the light was bright, it wasn't moving. He instantly knew that something had gone wrong. More than 20 minutes into the dive, he knew Shaw should be nearing him. He should have seen the light moving or bubbles ascending towards him, but all he saw was a motionless spotlight reaching the bottom of the cave. Shirley had no time. He couldn't panic and decided he would stay calm, even though he was sure that a still diver that deep was most likely dead. But it wasn't just a diver. It was his longtime close friend, Dave Shaw, and he had to do something, anything, to rescue him. So he thought maybe he could at least clip Shaw to the shot line to recover his body. He whispered to himself, "Okay, here we go then," and began the descent. Deeper than he had ever been at 800 feet, extreme pressure began to crush his hammerhead controller. The panic started to set in. Without his controller, Shirley would have to manually monitor his oxygen levels and inject the oxygen directly into his breathing loop. It would take all of his attention and was a last resort for divers who had reached a life-threatening depth. But if he went down, he and Shaw would decompose together at the bottom of Bushman's hole for eternity. He worked to get his rebreather back under control and started the ascent back up the trench. He cycled through alternate decompressors and was sure his rise would take at least 10 hours if he made it that long. Shirley looked back down and saw Shaw's light sputter out, consumed by the darkness, 29 minutes after Shaw had begun his descent. And 6 minutes after Shirley noticed the immobile glow of Shaw's light, support divers Stojakovic and Andrews began their dive to meet Shaw at 492 feet. But as they steadily reached their target depth, they realized they couldn't detect lights from Shirley or Shaw. Before they could panic, they hesitantly stuck to their plan. They were to wait 2 to 4 minutes before engaging in emergency protocol. They gave themselves 6 minutes before deciding it was time to go. They glanced down again, staring into the darkness, when they noticed a dim light in the depths. They didn't know who the light belonged to, but hoped it belonged to a living diver. Andrews pulled out his underwater slate and wrote, "Did not meet D+D at 150 meters for 6 minutes. One light below, not sure D's light's off." The divers began to swim upwards and met 2 other support divers, Erbst and Lo Vingerling. Andrews pulled out the slate to share the update with the team and continued swimming, determined to get the slate to the surface. It was then time for Erbst to continue the expedition. He felt a personal connection to finding the divers, as Don Shirley was his longtime best friend. Consumed with worry and feeling closer to finding the men, he began to pray. "Please, please God, don't let it be Don." Just halfway through the descent, a figure was moving below him. As they reached one another, Erbst internally heaved a sigh of relief. It was Shirley. He gave an okay sign to Erbst, but didn't look relieved just yet. He asked Erbst for his slate and quickly wrote, "Dave not coming back." The stakes were higher now. Submerged halfway into one of the deepest trenches on Earth, 2 bodies below them, and the dark water surrounding them. Shirley shared with Erbst that he needed to resurface. Lo Vingerling finally reached the men and signaled that he would continue to retrieve Dion. But Shirley reached out to him, communicating that there was no one to save down there. Dave was gone. Hundreds of feet above them stood the Dreyer family, teams of divers, and police anxiously awaiting the rescue of Dion and the resurfacing of the group of divers. The nervous silence was disrupted by the crinkling sound of stones in a plastic bottle. Attached to a line, the bottle was connected to the slates being sent up by the divers. Everyone on land held their breaths as the first slate, from Andrews and Stojakovic, rose to the surface. Instead of reading "one light below" on the slate, it was read as "no lights below." It was assumed that Shirley and Shaw were lost to the darkness of the trench. The teams of people fell to silence. It felt like hours while they privately considered the lives of the men and how quickly it had all turned. But only 30 seconds had passed before Von Schaik took a deep breath and announced, "Okay, we are on our emergency plan." 20 minutes later, another slate bubbled to the surface. Shirley's note that stated, "Dave not coming back." On the opposite side, Von Schaik read a scribbled note that detailed the new decompression plan that Shirley intended to follow to resurface safely. The Dryers felt panicked and powerless as the teams of officers and divers worked to rescue their son's body. Marie began sobbing, thinking of the diver who lost his life in the cave, like her son. Shaw's belongings were neatly scattered on the table in Shaw's room. Marie felt haunted by the items and whispered to herself, "It's like he's coming back soon to use it all again." But Von Schaik was running out of time and had to decide the next step. She had 5 divers in the water and needed to figure out what state they were in, so she ordered Gerhard Dupreez to dive next and search for the team. He geared up, climbed into the water, and took a deep breath before submerging himself into the hole. He found Shirley first, just below the main chamber, and ensured he was okay before resurfacing to update the team. When Dupreez began to swim back upward, Shirley was left alone. At about 164 feet, his head began to feel fuzzy, and he felt like something was off. He got off the rebreather and put the open circuit regulator in his mouth. But the moment he did, a helium bubble in his inner ear and the trenchant darkness spun around him. His light continued to flash around him as he began spinning into the cave's descent. He ignored the nausea and vertigo. All he could focus on was the panic. He'd never see his family again, his friends. He'd fail his mission and forever float at the bottom of this dark trench. As his head spun, he saw something flash by. The shot line. He started flailing his arms about to catch it, knowing it was his lifeline. Finally, he felt his hands clasp around the rope and used all the muscle he had to tighten around it. It was that grab that saved his life. If he hadn't had the shot line to hold on to, he would have floated down into the darkness, eventually fading away from the bends or lack of oxygen. When his vertigo began to diminish, he took the chance to read his rebreather. It told him that he had swum up to 114 feet in the trench. He was warned that if he wanted to keep his oxygen at a stable level, he would need to descend to 151 feet. Slowly, he began swimming down, tightly gripping onto the line. 148, 149, 150, 151 feet. He'd reached the depth required to survive, but the vertigo hit him again. Worse this time, as he started vomiting into the open water. It wouldn't stop. He kept removing and replacing the regulator in his mouth so he could throw up, and then his eyes landed on a glass cylinder not far from him. While still grasping on the line, he reached out and grabbed the cluster, pulling it towards him. He was hopeful that, maybe, just maybe, the extra oxygen would support him long enough. And still, he repeated to himself, "I will survive. I will survive. I will survive." 20 minutes passed by when Truman Laws, a reserve diver, finally appeared above Shirley. While immediately grateful for the first step in his rescue, he hastily pulled out his slate and scribbled, "I'm having a bad time. I've got vertigo, and I'm vomiting." When Laws double-checked Shirley's gas levels and decided he was safe, he rapidly began the ascent back up to update Von Schaik. Again, Shirley was left alone. The silence was deafening to him, alone in one of the deepest trenches on Earth with only the sounds of his gear to keep him company. With each breath he took came another spiraling thought. Where should I be now? How long should I be here? And where do I have to go? Eventually, all he could think of was how hard it was to breathe. He had to continue to instruct himself to breathe and stay alive. Suck, hold, exhale. Suck, hold, exhale. I will survive. I will survive. Without realizing how much time had passed, Shirley felt movement above him and saw a diver descending towards him. They clipped him into the shot line in case he lost consciousness again, only unclipping him when moving between decompression stops. But the vomiting didn't stop for Shirley. As he continued moving up, he kept getting sick. Shortly after beginning his ascent, Shirley received a slate. "Message from Andre. I love you," it read. And then, "You'd better hang in there or else." He felt lighter momentarily, like he might float to the surface on hope alone. It was 10 hours after Shirley made his initial descent. He finally reached 20 feet deep in the trench. He was wary and afraid he'd caught hypothermia. But still, Shirley stayed, treading and decompressing for 2 hours. Then he swam upwards towards 10 feet. Another 2 hours and 20 minutes went by before a sharp pain shot up his left leg. Afraid that this was a symptom of worsening bends, he pulled out his slate to show his fellow diver. "Lower left leg hurt. Could be lack of use," he wrote. Not long after, a reserve diver appeared and wrote the words he could always remember. "I'm here to take you home." He carried Shirley out of the passageway and through the water's surface. 22 minutes later, he was guided into the recompression chamber. Shirley was in Bushman's hole for nearly 12.5 hours. As the next couple of days passed, the dive team packed up and went home, but Herbst couldn't bring himself to leave. He collected the lines and cylinders left behind but felt connected to Shaw's mission. The police team held an impromptu memorial for Dave and Dion, remembering the task and the divers who had lost their lives to the deadly trench. "I'm going to miss you, mate," Herbst said. "It's a good place. Rest here. Stay here." Together, the people paying tribute sang Amazing Grace for the men who'd lost their lives. And Herbst and his friend, Petrus Rokes, dove in. Herbst couldn't shake the feeling that he would leave Bushman's hole with unfinished business. The divers descended down to 300 feet, attaching buoys to the shot line to raise the gas cylinders left behind. He and Rokes resurfaced and were asked by a police diver if they saw the bodies. Herbst hesitated a second before responding. "We saw Dion and Dave stuck in the cave at 20 meters. Herbst took some time before submerging himself back into the water. As he exited the narrow passageway, his light immediately locked onto Shaw, with his body spread wide, pushing against the ceiling of the trench. His light was hanging off his body, shining a spotlight on a headless body attached to his line. Dion. His light must have gotten tangled into the cave line, he thought. As he swam toward Shaw, Rokes appeared next to him. He stayed still, putting together that the bodies must have floated upwards when they had lifted the shot line earlier. As Shaw's body began ascending, his body expanded with gas, acting as a buoy almost for Dion's body. Herbst swam slowly down towards Dion's body, attaching him to his line and dragging him out. The police team heaved the body out of the pool of water and laid it on the white body bag. Dion felt heavy underneath his wetsuit, but he smelled of rotting flesh. As they were lifting him from the water, one of Dion's feet detached from his body, and one of the officers put it in a bag next to his decaying body. After nearly 10 years submerged in the darkness of Bushman's hole, Dion's body had finally been rescued. Next, Herbst brought Shaw to the surface. His body was heavier and swollen, locked with rigor mortis. Holding back his sadness at seeing Shaw in this state, he pulled out some scissors and cut Shaw out of his equipment so his body would stop swelling. It was 10 days later when Theo and Marie Dreyer visited the morgue to be reunited with their son. They weren't sure what to expect and were worried about how they might react. When Marie saw her son's body before her, she didn't feel sad. She felt whole and happy even at seeing her son again. Marie leaned forward towards Dion's body, running her hand along his arm before wrapping him in her arms. Dave's wife, Ann Shaw, on the other hand, was bothered when she was told that her husband's body had been recovered from Bushman's hole. He wished to rest in the trench forever, and she wanted to respect that wish. But after she processed her grief and anger, she realized there might still be a way for her to show her love and respect for Dave. Ann brought Shaw's ashes back to South Africa, reuniting him with a place he felt in his heart to be home. Thanks for watching Fear Frontier. If you would like to see more content like this, please see our last video, Unsolved Mysteries. Please like, subscribe, and comment below if you have any stories you want us to cover.